I remember when I was a kid that sometimes my family would watch a Western movie. And of course, in one of those Western movies, you usually have a cowboy or a series of cowboys who are fighting for American values or values of the New World. And they often are fighting against the Indians. And a lot of times you will hear a conversation between a cowboy and an Indian, which illustrates the importance of being able to not only know a set of vocabulary for a language, but also how to conjugate a language and conjugate verbs. And unfortunately, oftentimes the ignorance of the Indians was overplayed. But oftentimes the conversation would go like this: "Your corn we want," and the cowboy would say something like, "We have come in peace, but we cannot give you our corn." And the Indian would reply with something like, "See no corn? War." Such exchanges illustrate the importance of not just knowing the basic meaning of a word, but also knowing something about the conjugations and something about the syntax and how the words work together. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the basic function of verbs. When we studied nouns, we learned that they have case, number, and gender. We also learned that in Greek, nouns are more heavily declined than they are in English. In other words, each noun can have up to 8 forms. If it's an adjective, it can have even more, or an article or a pronoun, they can have even more because they also have 3 possible genders. But they're more heavily declined, they have these things. The verbs are going to have person and number, tense, voice, and mood. And these are things that you might say, oh, I've never been too good with grammar. Well, that's okay, because we actually already use all of these things really well in English. We just have to step back and analyze the things that we already know, and that will be a good introduction to how verbs work in Greek. If we take a verb like loose, specifically in the first person, I loose, and this is from luo because we're using luo as an example verb this year. This would be the first person, the number would be singular, the tense would be present tense because I loose, not I loosed or I will loose, I loose. The voice would be active because I'm the one doing it, and the mood would be indicative. So we're going to talk about these categories a little more in detail in this lesson. When we talk about person, we're talking about whether it's first, second, or third person. So there's 3 possibilities. If it's first person, it would be I or we. Second person would be you, or it could be you all, it could be plural. And then third, he, she, or it, or again if it's plural, it would be they. If it's first person, it's who is speaking or who is writing. If it's second person, it's to whom. And if it's third person, it's someone that we're talking about in the context. So there's 3 possibilities for person, and they can be singular or plural. It can be I or we, you or you all, or he, she, or it, or they. And so there's 6 in total, 6 possibilities when we're parsing. What's interesting when we look at these examples here, I speak, you speak, he speaks, we speak, you all speak, they speak. There's really not much variation in the English verb. The third person singular, the one that appears with he, it does have an S at the end, he speaks, but all of the others just appear the same way. This is kind of unique to the English language, at least when we're comparing it with Greek, and that's because the Greek language, the person is inherent in the verbal form. And so you don't always need to include the personal pronoun in Greek because it's clear in the form itself, and we're going to see more of that in the next few lessons. So we have person and number, but also tense, voice, and mood. So let's take a look at tense, voice, and mood. Tense has to do with when an action is done. Could be past, present, or future. So if I said, I loosed my dog Fido, that would be in the past. I loose, or we could also say or translate, I am loosing my dog Fido, that would be the present. And I will loose my dog Fido. So what we're saying is generally if it's past, we might add an ed to the form of the verb loosed. Sometimes it's more continuous. I was loosing. I loose or am loosing. In the future, we generally add a helping verb will to make clear to our listeners or our readers that it's an action in the future. There's also different ways we can describe these tenses. If I said, I will be loosing my dog Fido, again, that would be more of a continuous action. If we say, I will have loosed my dog Fido, that's a little more perfective. And we won't spend a lot of time on at least these future kinds of tenses this year, but we will see that there's different ways of describing an action that the form of the Greek verb can indicate. And that has to do with aspect. Aspect refers to how an action is done, and aspect is closely related to tense. Tense and aspect, but we're going to focus on tense this year. So when it comes to voice, active voice is the standard. You might remember from some of your grammar classes in elementary, maybe high school, that our teachers would often tell us, like my teachers did, prefer the active voice. Use the active voice as much as you can. And this is the standard voice in the Greek New Testament. Active is when the subject is doing the action. Passive voice is when the subject is acted upon. An example of the active would be the student completed his homework. So the student is doing this. The passive voice sometimes is just reversed. The homework was completed by the student. A lot of times we'll have the understood subject or the agent stated like by the student, but other times it won't appear. We can just end the sentence by saying the homework was completed, period. But sometimes you'll have a clarification of the agent too. There's this third voice in Greek that's called the middle voice, and many times when we see a verb in the middle voice, we'll talk about this later, we translate it as an active voice because that verb in English, when we're translating it over, has generally we just have it's an active verb. We don't have a nuance to kind of show that it has slightly reflexive implications. In other languages this is possible, but not so much in English. So generally when we see the middle voice we're going to translate them as active. But other times they will have more reflexive implications, and it's kind of this in-between voice. It's kind of active and passive in the sense that the subject is doing the action, but the consequences of the action fall back upon the subject. So it kind of has elements of both the active and passive, and I believe that's why it's called the middle voice. But generally we'll translate this as an active voice. And then we have mood. The mood of a verb refers to whether the action is certain, imagined, or conditional. So if we said, you gave me the key, so I went in. These two verbs are certain. They really happened. But if we have a sentence like this, if you had given me the key, I would have entered. Well, now it's a little more conditional. If this would have happened, I would have done this. In the first example, these would be indicative verbs, which normally indicate certainty. But in the bottom example here, these would be subjunctive verbs, in Greek at least. If you had given me, I would have entered. And that's because they're conditional, and they didn't really happen. Now we're in the realm of the theoretical, and that's generally what the subjunctive does. It refers to actions that are imagined or conditional. Something that we'll see as we do translations of the subjunctive, and that's still weeks off, but we'll see that there's this little word which makes an idea or a verb more conditional or subjunctive, and often the subjunctive verb will follow. It's this little word, on. And that's going to be a big help in determining the mood of a verb. It indicates that a subjunctive verb is in view. So one of the goals of this class is to give us an introduction to the Greek language, but also to lay a good foundation for being able to read the Greek New Testament. And just to give us an idea of the importance of verbs and the layout of how common the certain kinds of verbs are. The indicative appears 15,618 times in the Greek New Testament. The subjunctive only occurs 1,815 times, but it is a very significant mood. So we'll spend a little time studying the subjunctive verb. We'll spend even more time studying the participle. Generally, I tell students that the nouns and noun formation, along with indicative verbs and the participle, are the three biggest categories for being able to understand and read the Greek New Testament. So that's where we spend most of our time. The participle, there's 6,686 occurrences. The infinitive occurs just over 2,000 times, and the imperative will occur 1,631 times. And so we have now entered the period of verbs, where we'll be looking at how they form and how they can be used. And we'll spend the rest of the year really looking at verbal words.